Today, MiHoYo finally announced Dehya and Mika's release in the 3.5 patch livestream. Their kits were showcased, but of course, thanks to our remarkable prediction capabilities, we were all able to guess their kits with 100% accuracy in the past month, which is also how I've been able to make videos on them. MiHoYo, please don't execute me. Jokes aside, if you followed Genshin leaks updates in the past few weeks, you probably have a somewhat truthful idea of how these new characters will look. Regardless, in this video I will go through Dehya's entire kit, while explaining her weaknesses and strengths, and also showing you optimal artifact, weapon and team selections. Let's get straight into it. First of all, what type of character is she? Dehya, by design, is a defensive character with some offensive capabilities on top of that. This is made clear by how much of her kit relies on her capability to aid allies from a defensive standpoint. Primarily, her elemental skill will create a field called Fury Sanctum, whose size is the same as Albedo's elemental skill. The field will last for 12 seconds, with a cooldown of 20 seconds. Whenever active characters within this field take damage, a part of that will be redirected to Dehya instead over 10 seconds, up to a total limit which is 200% of her maximum HP. This mitigation effect scales up with the elemental skill talent levels, and it reaches 50% at talent level 10. Practically, what this means is that your active character will be able to take double the damage he would be able to take normally, if he's standing within Dehya's field. In other words, it's as if your active character will have double HP as long as he's staying within the field. A popular comparison for her defensive capabilities has been Xingqiu's Rain's Words, which generally provide active characters of 42% damage reduction in total. While the effect is the same in terms of how it almost doubles the amount of hits the active characters will be able to take, there are a few differences to keep in mind here. First, since in Dehya's case that half of the damage is being redirected to her, this adds an element to her gameplay that Xingqiu doesn't have, namely the fact you may need to pay attention to her own health too during gameplay. The second difference is that Dehya's damage mitigation is specifically applied when your active character takes damage. Meanwhile, in Xingqiu's case, it's a damage reduction effect that applies on all damage received, so it's applied even if the damage is taken by a shield, effectively reducing the damage shields will take by 42%. This factor makes shields incredibly hard to break when they're surrounded by Xingqiu's Rain's Words, and makes his utility more versatile. The similarities with Xingqiu don't end here. In fact, both the skills apply Interruption Resistance on allies. In Dehya's case, thanks to her first passive, her field will provide active characters with complete Interruption Resistance for 9 seconds out of the skill's total duration, while for the remaining 3 seconds, it will only provide partial Interruption Resistance. This partial interruption resistance is actually smaller than the one Xingqiu provides, but since it's just for 3 seconds, it's not a huge deal. All in all, by itself, Dehya's defensive utility is not bad, but it starts looking worse if you take into account how much of her kit is focused on that specifically. In fact, both her elemental skill and her 2 passives completely focus on her defensive side. To expand on her passives, excluding the interruption resistance effect I just talked about, the rest of its effects revolve around the concept of keeping Dehya alive. By this, I mean that her first passive will apply a 60% damage reduction on the damage she'll receive after mitigation, whenever she uses the second cast of her elemental skill or her elemental burst. To elaborate on these two, Dehya's elemental skill has a first cast which lets you activate the Fury Sanctum, and a second cast which deals some damage and allows you to reposition Dehya's field. This can be good for positioning reasons, and of course for the passive I just mentioned. Her second passive gives her a self-healing effect, which will heal her by 20% of her maximum HP once her health falls below 40%, and an additional 30% throughout 10 seconds. This effect can be triggered every 20 seconds, which is basically every rotation. So, assuming your Dehya has a defensive build, meaning HP Sans and the Tenacity of Millelith set, she'll have around 34,000 health. This means she can heal up to 17,000 of her own health every rotation, which sounds like a fine amount. It makes her dying from mitigation alone pretty much impossible, as your active characters would have to take around 100,000 worth of damage for it to overwhelm her maximum HP amount and her healing. That said, mitigation damage might not be the only thing threatening her. In fact, her Elemental Burst is a 70 energy cost attack that turns Dehya into an on-field damage dealer for around 7 seconds, 2 of which being required for her burst cast time. During this time, Dehya will retrieve her Fury Sanctum and pummel opponents with an amount of phased hits that can go up to 10, depending on how fast you spam the normal attack button. After that, she will deal a final hit called Incineration Drive. Basically, if you plan to use her burst, you'll have to keep in mind there will be a 5 seconds window every rotation where she'll take direct damage from enemies, which might make keeping her alive a bit trickier than you would expect if you don't have a HP Sans equipped. If you made it this far and you aren't particularly impressed by Dehya's capabilities, beware, it's only getting worse from now on. In fact, her offensive capabilities are the most inexplicable part of her kit, and they are the main reason there has been so much negative fuss about her in particular in the past few weeks. Going in order, her Elemental Skill Fieldcast and Recast will both deal damage to opponents on hit, and additionally, the field will hit opponents who are standing within it with coordinated pyro attacks at intervals of 2.5 seconds each, whenever they're hit by any of the team's characters' moves. The skill will generate 1 particle every hit. Assuming a realistic 5 hits per rotation, that puts Dehya's particle generation at 5 per rotation, which is not great to say the least. By hitting every 2.5 seconds, the skill will apply 1 gauge unit of pyro every hit, and while this might sound good, it's not really optimal for enabling purposes if compared to Xianling's Elemental Burst or the Burning Elemental Reaction. Also, the skill's damage is ridiculously low, as it will deal around 60,000 damage per rotation even if you assume Bennett and Kazuha are on the team. Still, considering the benefits of its defensive utility, it's okay for it to be mediocre offensively. The real jumbled mess is her Elemental Burst. As I mentioned earlier, it's a 7 seconds window in total that will generate up to 11 hits. The issue here is simple: the burst damage is too low to justify using it on many setups, considering the field time it requires you to spend. Its damage per rotation on a monopyro team is 250,000, which is an amount even sub-DPS can easily reach. Still, I wish the issue was only the damage dealt. If prior to her announcement you were expecting Dehya to be a 5-star Xianling, you were partially right, but only for the negatives. By this, I mean that her energy issues are some of the worst you'll encounter in this game. Because of her having an off-field damage dealing elemental skill, whose particle generation is spread out throughout its duration, you won't be effectively able to feed its particles to Dehya directly, or even pre-funnel like many other energy-starving units can do. If this wasn't enough, Dehya disables the elemental skill during her burst time, and will reactivate it after the burst ends, while not refreshing its duration. This means that in realistic rotations, Dehya won't generate any particles for herself at all. This aspect ties her to Bennett in a must-have way, since it's the only good pyro battery in the game. However, this creates another conceptual issue. Bennett is a healer, which means that on a team where he can be used, Dehya's defensive utility becomes less needed. excluding her interruption resistance effect. Basically, if you want to take advantage of her elemental burst, you need to use a character that makes the majority of her kit redundant. That's just great, isn't it? All of this brings up the question, is her elemental burst worth the huge hassle? I will expand on this on the team building section. In the meantime, my overall impression of her kit is that her defensive utility level is more or less comparable to Xingqiu's, with nowhere near the offensive contribution needed to justify it. If you're in the camp that thinks her offense is basically useless, that makes her more comparable to shielders such as Zhongli or Layla that can all compensate for their defensive deficiencies with a level of defensive contribution Dehya can touch, as again, using her on a team will be very similar to using Xingqiu as a singular defensive unit, which is obviously worse than using some of the best shielders in the game. About her weapon choices, during beta I've been calculating under the impression that Serpent Spine would work on her, meaning that I thought her stacks wouldn't decay due to her off-field mitigation damage received. This made the weapon very strong in my former analysis. However, while Serpent Spine doesn't actually lose stacks off field, the same won't apply while she's on field. Since the mitigation is spread out over 10 seconds, that means it will keep doing damage to her while on field, and drain her of the Serpent Spine stacks as a result. Due to this, for reactionless teams, her signature weapon, the Beacon of the Red Sea, is by far her best option. The best cheap option will be Akumaru, and even that isn't very cheap considering it's tied to specific event weapon banners. Although it's worth noting that since her damage output is not very high to begin with, losing even 20% out of her optimal output won't make a huge difference in terms of team DPS. Things start changing a bit if you assume she can make 5 hits in total during her elemental burst, which will happen if you pair her with units such as Mona or even Xingqiu with his surrounding Rainsword's application alone. In this scenario, elemental mastery weapons gain more ground, and specifically, the 3.5 free event weapon becomes very nice for her. Alternatively, if you don't care too much about her damage in particular, or if you're not interested in using her burst at all, supportive weapons such as Favonius for particle generation, or Sacrificial to increase her skill uptime, or even Aquamarine all become main options. Regarding her artifacts, the Emblem of Severed Fate set is pretty great, and generally better than the Crimson Witch set for her for reactionless teams, while the second becomes a bit better if you take into account some waves from her elemental burst, thanks to its buff to Vaporize. It's worth noting that she'll be only able to activate 1 or 2 stacks of the Crimson Witch set per rotation. Alternatively, the Tenacity of Milalith set is a decent option too, it actually becomes your best in slot option for burst-less rotations, as in that case you don't need to care about her damage, but rather just her utility. Her elemental skill will proc its buff 5 times per rotation, giving it an okay-ish 10 seconds uptime per cast. Regarding Dehya's Constellations, they're quite strong. In particular, her Constellation one is an uncharacteristic damage increase, as it adds extra HP multipliers to her kit and increases her HP percentage. With Bennett on the team, this is a 28% damage increase for her. Her Constellation 2 is a nice utility buff, as it extends her elemental skill uptime to 18 seconds per rotation. Not only that, but it makes it deal more damage by naturally increasing its procs per cast, and increasing its damage dealt depending on whether or not your active character gets hit during proc intervals. Constellation 3 increases her burst talent level by 3, which is meaningful considering the burst is 80% of her damage output. Constellation 4 basically fixes her energy issues, providing her of a 16.5 energy refund per rotation. At this Constellation level, she will only need around 120% energy recharge assuming you have a Bennett on the team and a Favonius weapon too. Constellation 5 increases her elemental skill talent level by 3. For damage purposes, this is basically irrelevant, as her skill is a very small part of her kit's damage, but the utility implications make it okay, as her mitigation reaches 56% at talent level 13. Constellation 6 is, predictably, her best upgrade. It increases her elemental burst crit rate, and every time it crits, it will increase her burst duration by 0.5 seconds, and increase her hit crit damage by 15. This effect can be applied 4 times. In my calculations, I assume this increases her total face count from 10 to 15, and that she reaches 60 critical damage around the 6th hit. Even assuming this extends her team's rotations by 2 seconds, this is a 46% damage increase over Constellation 5 on reactionless teams. Talking about her team options now, as you might have guessed from the other stuff I said in the video, her use cases differ depending on whether you want to use her burst or not. As I said earlier, due to its huge time requirements and relatively low damage output, it becomes hard to use her burst in most rotations which already include a carry, so somebody like Hu Tao or Ganyu, since the team DPS will sadly be higher if you use her as an elemental skill bot in that case. Alternatively, if you can make her bursts fit standard rotations duration, which is the case for quick swap teams that don't have a carry, so teams like Monopyro and Reverse Melt, then using her burst is worth it. Still, she won't perform greatly there, as she's relative to Xingqiu in terms of damage contribution for the team, assuming same investment level for both. This makes her defensive utility the only truly interesting part of her kit at Constellation 0, but since, as I said earlier, using her is roughly comparable to using Xingqiu as the only defensive option on a team, that also makes her defensive contribution kinda average. The only interesting team option I can think of here is using her as an elemental skill bot for Ganyu, in conjunction with Bennett and Kazuha, or burning strategies to enable melt for her and provide some much needed interruption resistance effects. Even then, she loses to Zhongli in those roles offensive contribution wise. This is truly an extreme case as far as Genshin releases go, as it's very rare for a new 5-star to be objectively mediocre. Even considering the fact she's a standard pool character, she looks pretty meh compared to somebody like Tignari, who can at least excel in his role. If you assume her being a standard character makes her constellations easier to obtain, then her kit starts making sense, because basically all the constellations are good, but it might take a long time for you to obtain them if you're free to play. And sure, while there is a margin of error with pre-release theory crafting, and we need to wait for release date tests for more accurate calcs and estimations, it's honestly very hard for me to think of a scenario where Dehya becomes worth pulling at Constellation 0. As things are now, I would say her pull value is comparable to somebody like Diluc, so we're talking bottom of the barrel stuff here. I'm done for today. As always, make sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe. See you next time!